Shannon Appelcline is the author of Designers and Dragons, the history of role-playing industry told one company at a time, which is a really good tagline there. These stories were published in a 4-book series covering the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. They're available electronically on DriveThruRPG, audiobooks on Audible, and some editions are still in print, although I found it's pretty getting hard to, harder to get nowadays. If there's one person who knows the history of role-playing game industry, it is Shannon Appelcline, who is joining us from beautiful Hawaii. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you very much, Gary. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I have to say that, and I don't know if you've seen my own personal journey, but you actually played a big role in me kind of getting caught up on all the stuff that I had missed over the years, because I did like a big dropout when I had kids and, pursued careers and that kind of thing. But when I discovered your books, and actually it took me a while to hunt them down, but it really brought me up to speed on what was happening within the RPG world.
Well, that's great to hear. You might be surprised to hear that I was writing the books originally to kind of get caught up to speed myself. I started working for Chaosium in the late 90s, and I stopped having any money when I started working for Chaosium, which is pretty much how the whole role-playing industry works. And so beforehand, I'd been interested in buying everything from the Traveler publisher at the time, who was Imperium Games. Stopped buying things, and 5-10 years later, I looked, they weren't around anymore, and I said, what happened to them? And so I started researching them, finding out what was going on, and catching up myself. And then, because I'm a writer, I decided I had to write it down too. So it was kind of the same journey for me in some ways, getting caught up after I worked in the industry for a bit and then stepped back for a bit.
Well, let's maybe back up to where did you actually start being involved with role-playing games in the first place? How was your journey? Everybody's kind of got that first moment where they discovered role-playing games. Maybe you can bring us up to speed on how that happened.
Sure. I somehow or another found out about Dungeons and Dragons. If I had to guess, I might say I saw it advertised in a comic book, but I'm not sure. But I started hinting to my father that perhaps I would like to receive Dungeons and Dragons as a birthday present. And he, being the greatest father in the world, bought me Dungeons and Dragons for my birthday or Christmas. I'm not really sure which. And since I didn't have anyone to play it, learned the rules as best as he could. He found the combat very confusing, and put together a dungeon and ran it for me. And I should say, he is not a game player. He doesn't like games. And so this was like the ultimate sacrifice. And, he still didn't understand the combat rules. And so he kind of fell back on the type of thing you might do in an adventure game, which we'd both played, these text-based adventure games. And so when there was a room of skeletons that needed to be defeated, there were rocks handily on the floor that you could pick up and throw at them to knock them down if you knew how. But that's how I got started, was with Dungeons and Dragons, run by my father. And you mentioned that I'm in beautiful Hawaii here. I actually moved almost a year and a half ago. And one of the main reasons was so that we could be close to them. They're about a mile over from where our house is. My dad and my stepmom are.
Oh, wow. That's ideal. And where were you before you moved to Hawaii?
Berkeley, California. Lived in the California Bay Area almost my entire life, and in Berkeley for the 30 years before we moved up here.
Wow. And then maybe that brings me to, I know you had mentioned about your time with Chaosium, and was that while you were in the Bay Area?
Yep. I was working for Chaosium from 1996 to 98, something like that. I went to school at Cal, and when I was at Cal, I got more and more involved with Chaosium's games, RuneQuest in particular, but I also learned about Call of Cthulhu. I increased my interest in Stormbringer, and so I started thinking, I'd really like to work for them. I didn't know at the time that role-playing companies tended to be so small that they had no staff, and thinking you could work for anyone other than, TSR at the time, if you were in the Midwest, was a pipe dream. Started writing for them. I started running an online magazine called the Chaosium Digest, which I ran for, seems like forever, but I think it was only 3 or 4 years. And in doing all of these things, I came to their attention. I also got a little experience writing for White Wolf and a few other people. And then this whole thing called CCGs came about, and they put out their own, which was the Mythos collectible card game, and they suddenly had piles of money that they didn't know what to do with. And so they increased their staff from, I think it was about 7 people before the CCGs to about 20. And my friend Eric Rowe got hired on. And then between my connection to him and my connection having written books, they hired me on too. And so I stayed there through the height of the CCG craze. I saw them literally lay off every single paid employee except me, and decided that it was starting to make me a little nervous. And so after a couple of years, moved back into the computer industry where I've spent most of my professional career.
Wow. And I will touch on that a little bit later, but it's one thing that I've kind of noticed while reading your books is that the boom and the bust of the industry, which I'm going to pick your brain on a little bit later when we go into some deeper dives on topics. And we have our first cat. I think I mentioned to you that I've got a cat roaming around and you got a cat roaming around. And if one of them showed up, I was going to do a giveaway. So I'll figure that out by the end. I got a t-shirt. So anybody that makes a comment, I might I'll send them a t-shirt based upon how many cats show up.
Yeah, this is Callisto here. She hates it when I talk to computers and has to see what's going on. She gets very upset at our digital assistant, whose name I cannot mention lest she start talking to, and definitely when I'm Zooming as well.
Yeah, they like your full attention, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
And so going back to your time there in Chaosium, you also did the trade talk. Is that kind of all part of like that towards the tail end of your time there?
Yeah, Trade Talk was a Gloranthan / Chaosium fanzine that was run out of Germany by the German RuneQuest Society, later the Chaos Society. Same people who do the Tentacles conventions out there every year, and now I forget what the name of the current one is. And so I was a member of the RuneQuest fandom, I think even before I was working at Chaosium. It was it was an invigorating, exciting community feeling fandom. There were these people from all over the world that were all writing about this rule system, and more importantly, this world, which was Glorantha. I got to meet people in Britain. I went to Britain for a convention. I got to meet people all over the US and in Canada. And I think we really felt like a community to a certain extent, because the official publisher of RuneQuest at that time was Avalon Hill, not Chaosium. They totally let the game down. They, had a brief renaissance and then they stopped publishing it. And so we fans were the only one that could do anything. And I think that drew us together. And Greg Stafford regularly attended the conventions, and Sandy Peterson. And it was just very exciting. I think it was probably the closest I've ever felt to a community in role playing. So I wasn't exactly that I was doing that because I was working at Chaosium. It was just part of the same interest that made me want to work at Chaosium. And I'm working on that. I was working on that before we started talking about half an hour ago, because I'm working on a new book for RuneQuest, because they have Chaosium has RuneQuest back, and the people running Chaosium now are some of the leaders of the fan community from the 90s. It's a very exciting time for the game.
Oh, wow. And you mentioned a couple of like major players in the industry of Greg Stafford and Sandy Peterson. And I know that you got Greg to do the forward of your very first, the 70s book, correct? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you got to work with him?
I did. So during the 2 years at Chaosium, we were in a little kind of expanded warehouse space out on the bad side of Oakland, not the worst side of Oakland, but the bad side of Oakland. So his office was about 10 feet from mine. I was mostly working on Call of Cthulhu because, like I said, we didn't have RuneQuest at the time. Pendragon wasn't making enough money. Nephilim wasn't making enough money. So most of what we were doing was either Call of Cthulhu or the Mythos card game. But, I don't know, every week, every month, so long ago, after work, I'd sometimes wander into Greg's office and we'd talk about RuneQuest stuff. My friend Eric and I ran a convention, RuneQuest Con 2. I think that was probably just before I was working there, but that was the first time I remember sitting in his office and talking. And that was also when I started working on the Elves of Glorantha. Greg and I would, talk about ways to expand their mythology. He gave me a lot of material that Ken Rolston had put together for a book that Avalon Hill never published on the Elves of Dorister. It was just cool. Greg was a very imaginative person. You could just see sometimes when a new idea had come into his head and suddenly he was telling you about it like that is how it had always been.
Wow, and I think in some of the stories I've read, you got to just pick his brain and kind of just see where things were going and what was bubbling up.
His brain and his file cabinet, which was just as important. I still have some spiral bound books that I have made of some of his material to use for my own work that I'm still doing.
Oh, wow. Well, and then, so you left that work, and at what point did the inspiration for Designers and Dragons take place? Like, how did that start?
I think it was 2005. So I was working at SCOTUS Tech, which was an online game company. And SCOTUS Tech acquired RPGNet, which was the top independent role-playing site on the internet. And I became the editor-in-chief of it, which meant as much as anything that I kind of oversaw it, made sure that if any of our volunteer staff had questions, I could address them. If there was anything that they needed dealt with, which usually meant someone was threatening things legally, I could deal with it. But I also did the programming. So we had original code that Sandy Antunes had done 1995 to 2000 or so, and it needed to be refreshed. So 2005, we went to Gen Con. And this is when I started thinking more about the industry after being kind of out of it for a few years after my years at Chaosium. And I came back from that Gen Con and I said, I'd really like to put together an index of role-playing products. And part of what I wanted to do was discover what was going on with some of these companies that I'd missed out on, like the Imperial Games that I mentioned. And some of it was that I wanted to expand on the last really good index of role-playing books, which had been out in 1990 or so. I actually got right here because I still use a reference. That's Heroic Worlds by Lawrence Schick. And so I started doing this programming, started coding this, and this kind of raised these questions of what happened to these companies. And so that was what directly led me to starting to write these histories. Published them on RPGNet, and after I'd done several of them probably, I started getting some queries from people saying, hey, you should publish this. And eventually a publisher and I came together and agreed, hey, we were going to publish this. And I rather frantically worked to finish the original book that was eventually published by Mongoose. And then a few years later, I published it in the expanded 4-book farm with Evil Hat.
Okay, so the Mongoose one, I've seen references to the Big Black book. Did you have all 4 in that book for the Mongoose one?
No, not exactly. I don't seem to have my copy here anyway. A year and a half later, and we're still not unpacked, but that's been partially pandemic related.
Yeah.
The original Mongoose book was shorter. I used to know the page counts off the top of my head. The 4-book series are like 500,000 words. The Mongoose book was 2/3 of that, half of that. I'm not really sure. It was a really hefty, dense, big book, but it did get considerably expanded. What I did was I split it by the decades, and I looked at each decade and said, how much more do I need to add to expand it out to about 120,000 words, which would make it a book. And as I recall, the 80s book was just about done. I had almost everything in the 80s I needed. And the 70s, I added like 4 short histories. The 90s, I don't know. And the odd aughts was mostly new.
And I can't even imagine, you're talking in the millions of words here, that just
that's
the commitment.
500,000 right now.
500,000. But the commitment it takes to do that, I would say most game designers are maybe notoriously kind of procrastinators. And so how did you sit down and actually delve into it and produce that much?
I think it varies from person to person. I certainly know people in the industry who write phenomenal amounts of content. When I was writing the histories, for example, I was stunned by Stephen Long, who used to do work for Hero Games in its last incarnation, who would regularly write, I think it was over 1 million words a year, but I'm not sure anymore. It's been a while since I looked at the numbers. How I did it is I would work all day for SCOTUS, I would eat dinner, and then I would go work all night on Designers and Dragons until an hour before bed when I needed to stop so I could actually sleep that night. I look back, and to a certain extent, I have no idea how I did all of that work, but I do remember that largely being the pattern, that I would fairly regularly spend 4 to 6 hours in the evening after my regular workday. And I really don't know how I put together some of them, because my memory of the structures that I would research and often write a history within the same day or two. Not the procedure I have now, but I'm probably doing a lot deeper work right now, which we'll probably get to.
Yeah, for sure. We'll definitely touch on your next steps on your journey and your knowledge of the industry. But I was just curious also, like, how much research do you do for this? Do you have like banker boxes full of odds and ends, or like how do you get all this information in one spot?
I do have boxes full of odds and ends. When I was working on the original Designers and Dragons, my primary source was magazines. The magazines from the 70s and 80s, and to a certain extent the 90s, were just phenomenal for revealing what was going on at the industry at the time. If sometimes I would find interviews, I would find designers' notes, I would find introductions in books, and those would just be the gold mine that really talked about how things work, because I always tried very hard to make Designers and Dragons not just a listing of what companies did, but a discussion of the reasons that they did what they did, and kind of interlinking of trends and tropes, and a look at design patterns and all of that. I still have all of those magazines. When I moved my whole collection to Hawaii, I culled out a lot of stuff, but the magazines were not touched because they remain critical sources. As I get more and more into newer companies, the internet becomes a better and better source. Archive.org is one of my prime things I use, because it has our web pages archived back about 25 years. And so I am often able to step back through every press release, every design note, everything that a company wrote over a up to 20 or 25 year period. I also feel like the OSR and kind of an increasing interest in classical and traditional games has made it easier and easier to research. I feel like the research that I'm doing now is better and easier than what I was doing 10 years ago. And that's primarily due to people being more willing to say things on the internet. Mind you, if it's a person talking about a company he used to work at 20 or 25 years ago, you have to take that with a serious grain of salt. The original sources always remain the best. The original sources still tend to be in those magazines and on other designer notes. But often they will be saying things that weren't discussed or touched upon. And so you can say those are great details, and you can offer them with the appropriate grain of salt. The biggest problem I have in researching nowadays is I have to decide when I am done. I can just research forever on some of these topics. There are ones where I reach the extent of what is available in the printed record, or at least the printed record available to me. But there are ones where I never reach that end and have to decide I have found enough details. I have a monthly pattern right now, which again, we will probably get to. And that helps keep me honest and, not doing too much primarily.
Well, I mean, just the depth of knowledge that you must have, I have to ask you, of writing all the books, what have you learned about the industry and the people? Is there kind of some common threads that you've seen throughout?
Yeah, I would say so. There are, the thing that I learned most, to address that first, is I learned about the whole indie movement. I've been gaming since 1982, I think. And so, most of the things I was interested in were pretty old school. My earliest games were D&D, Traveler, Champions. And so, I was very used to the, murder hobo D&D games, the, punching other people in the face Champions games. And so I was a pretty traditional player. But when I started working on Designers and Dragons, the Odd, when I started expanding them for Evil Hat, I learned about all of these indie games, which are just amazing. One of my favorites nowadays is not even quite a role-playing game. It's a game called Microscope by Ben Robbins, which is all about laying out a history of a world, a city, a civilization, whatever you want, in kind of a fractal manner, where you learn a little bit and then you learn a little bit more and you learn a little bit more. It's an amazing game. The Burning Wheel is the last game I ran in Berkeley before I headed out here to Hawaii. And I was just won over, when I was writing Designers and Dragons, by this integration of a fairly complex simulation system with, a lot of stuff about personal goals and interest and responses. They call it their BIT system, which must be beliefs, instincts, traits. And so that's what I learned most. Common trends, unshockingly, role-playing people are really bad at business. There seem to be two really big trends where creative people run a business and they run it into the ground. And on the other side, business people who don't really know or care about role-playing games run a business and they alienate the creators and they run it into the ground. So I guess you could say running it into the ground is another trend. I think maybe that might be changing now, because we're getting a second or third generation of people running companies, and they tend to be the people who kind of played D&D and other role-playing games when they were young, and many of them are now, professional business people. I talked about Chaosium earlier and how it has come under the ownership of people who, were leaders in fandom in the 90s. They're also, great professional business people. I know one of them's a lawyer, another of them has done international business. Another thing I've been looking at lately are Swedish companies, and I was very surprised to see that one of the Swedish companies, it's called Riot Minds, is run by very professional business people, and that there's all these interconnections between these Swedish companies and, literally billion-dollar companies, often run by the same people. Paradox Interactive's the one I'm thinking of in particular, which is, a billion-dollar computer game company, and it has very tight connections to Riot Minds, among others.
Yeah. Well, and I think, just speaking of that, I kind of find myself in the same boat of taking a long gap and coming back and going, I've always had that itch that I want to scratch. And for whatever reason, I just never got to it. And now I find myself with the flexibility, I guess, in my own career path, that I can dive back in and go, this is something that I had wanted to do my whole life. And, I was always passionate about it. And now I actually feel like I can do it with all the tools and resources that are out there for indie game developers now.
Yeah, I feel like what you're expressing as your path there is a pretty general one. We're just all over the world, particularly all over the US, we're seeing people who grew up with role-playing games and have had very successful professional careers now coming back and, talking about it. And I think that's a lot of what's leading to the mass market popularization of role-playing games at the moment. It's, these individuals who are willing to say, oh, there's cat number 2. There's these individuals who are willing to say, yes, I'm a fan of role-playing games. I love the fact that the people working on Star Trek Discovery are running their own role-playing games now. They started it just as a way to, get together with their castmates during the pandemic when they couldn't otherwise. They started playing D&D over Zoom. And I think that's something that we're seeing repeating all over, that, we might have been, the people that were kind of the weirdos on the outside when we were growing up, but now we weirdos on the outside are running the country, running the world.
Well, I mean, I don't know if maybe I shouldn't have been so shy about it growing up, but I remember I grew up in a small town in Canada, and I played hockey, and boy, I had to kind of almost hide my love of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games because it just was not the cool thing to do. And I know, whether it's Stranger Things or Big Bang Theory or any of those, the pop culture has come back, and now it's like something that you don't have to hide. It's like watching wrestling, at the time you would never say you'd watch wrestling or play role-playing games, and now it's okay to say.
Yeah, I think probably the streaming of things, Critical Role and all the rest, that's probably helped because people can watch it as a sport now without having to participate. And so it feels like it's more of the, media.
And maybe that, segues us nicely into the popularity of 5e. And do you kind of have a sense of like the halo effect of 5e's popularity and what it's doing for the whole industry or independent designers?
I feel like that's always been very hard to say. I think we've always felt like, if D&D is doing well, the rest of the industry is doing well. I certainly wrote when D&D 4e was doing very badly that I felt like it was hurting the rest of the industry. So I guess I would have to say the converse must be true. I certainly agree that 5e is doing phenomenally, that Wizards of the Coast has done a great job of resurrecting the line, and I think they're probably finding more success than they did even during the heady D20 days. It's hard to say beyond that, but my intuition, my hope is that it is making the rest of the industry do better. I think there are other things that might be more important. Kickstarter, I think, is the biggest one. It's created a whole totally different world for RPG sales, but I have to assume people come into the industry through 5e and then they move on to other things. I remember a time some years ago, it was in the 80s, where there was talk about, TSR expected people to move through D&D in 2 years and, enter and exit the industry. So if anything like that is same true, we might be losing a lot of those, but also some of those are probably going on to other games.
And definitely you mentioned Kickstarter, and I know that you've done a number of articles on it in the past, and they're just highlighting the growth and exposure that Kickstarter is giving people. And I know I don't think Indiegogo is as popular, at least in the role-playing game world, but I mean Kickstarter, boy, like I think Free League, one of those Swedish companies, they just did a Kickstarter, and it was like phenomenal how much they received from it.
Yeah, that was the One Ring Kickstarter, and it clocked in at almost exactly $2 million USD. I've been tracking the Kickstarter since 2011, 2012, something like that. The first year I took note of it, I was very excited to see that there were some Kickstarters that were earning $10,000 or $20,000. That was amazing. And then the next year we had 10 or so that made $100,000. And I forget if last year or the year before I recorded 46. I know last year I spent days recording everything, so it was quite a few. And we've had half a dozen over $1 million. Russ Morrissey over at InWorld just put together a list of all of the role-playing companies that have earned over $1 million on Kickstarter, summing up their things, and he came up with 12, 20, I don't know. It was an amazing number, but Kickstarter has evolved the industry in a number of ways. It's, I think, made it easier for the classic revivals that we've been seeing because they can communicate with the old fans who are not necessarily going into game stores anymore. It has certainly led to the international success of companies like those Swedish companies, and probably also Ulysses Spiel, who is German with a North American arm, and Studio Agate, who is French. They would not have been able to reach an international audience well without Kickstarter. I mean, we certainly saw companies in the 90s and aughts who tried and could not. I think it's probably also allowed for kind of the popularization of some of the indie things, things that would have been published anyways, because when you create an indie game, you can make a few hundred copies, 1,000 or something, sell them simply. But it's allowed some of those to become very popular and reach a lot of audience, which is probably going to change how the overall industry is thinking about role-playing games as well, because they're seeing these new mechanics.
And so with Dungeons and Dragons, just going back there for a second, I think next year is the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a lot of speculation of a 6E. Do you have any kind of hunch on where that's going to go?
Yeah,
if they're going to just do the 5.5?
We're actually still a few years out. D&D was out in January 1974.
Okay.
So this year is the 50th anniversary of Chainmail, which was kind of the predecessor. So who knows? 6E, I've heard people say it mostly on April 1st this year. I would very much like not to see it, because I believe we have seen severe damage from 3.5E and from 4E, and 5E has been greatly successful, but only because it was undoing the damage of the last two. You talked earlier about trends in role-playing games, and I would say one trend that we have seen is companies destroying their product and their audience by releasing incompatible new editions, either incompatible rule-wise or incompatible setting-wise. And so I would personally prefer that Wizards of the Coast not mess around with, what is hopefully doing well for the industry and is clearly doing very well for them. And my guess would be that's probably going to be their inclination too. I also do wonder if Wizards of the Coast could even do a 6E at this point if they wanted to, because one of the big news items that we were seeing probably throughout the 10s was them cutting their staff again and again and again. And when 5E first came out, if you look back, several of those initial releases were actually done by third parties. Green Ronin did one of the early adventure books. Sasquatch did one of the early adventure books. I think there was one more. And so you go up to, what was it called, Out of the Abyss, that far, and they were still depending on other people to do their products. So do they even have a team to do a 6E if they want? I have no idea, but I hope we'll stick with 5E, or if they do decide they need to do a new edition, that it will be something that remains compatible, maybe has some great improvements, but is something that will not take the chances that 3, 5E, and 4E did.
And then that probably leads into the boom and the bust of the industry, whether it's cards or D20 running its course, or do you get a sense that it could happen again, or is it one of those things that they're on solid footing now and the industry's grown and could sustain something like that?
Well, I was pretty solidly predicting that there was going to be a Kickstarter bust anytime in the future from, maybe 2012 to 2016 or so. That clearly didn't happen, and I do not think it is going to happen at this point. It seems to have become a solid part of the industry. The danger of the boom and bust cycle is that things are getting produced at levels higher than the consumers are actually using them. It comes, I think, one part from, collector fever, and one part from, kind of a Pokemon-ish, gotta have them all. And so I mentioned 3 booms and busts in the industry. The first one was only peripherally related to the industry, and that was the black and white comic boom and bust, which occurred in the 80s. And I mentioned it because it affected some of the companies in the industry. It impacted their distributors, and that meant they ended up not getting money. The two big ones, though, were the CCG boom and bust in the 90s and the D20 boom and bust, which was pretty much 2003 and 4. And I feel pretty solidly in both of those cases that things were being purchased at a level that was so far in excess of what it had been before that it was clearly in excess of how people were using them. I mean, I was buying $100 boxes of Magic the Gathering cards in the 90s, and then Jihad cards, and then Mythos cards before I started working there, Wyvern cards, Holy Grail cards, and any number of other ones that you have never heard of, SimCity cards, Illuminati. And that was clearly in excess of my normal spending for role playing. And I didn't do the same in the D20 boom because that's kind of when I was not very much involved in the industry. But I know a lot of people were going and buying everything they could for D20 until they couldn't anymore. I don't think I'm seeing that now. Again, I was worried about for Kickstarter for a while because there certainly seemed to be people that were, talking about how they were, backing tens of Kickstarters every month. And I suspect that is still going on, but doesn't seem to have busted. And if it hasn't by now, I don't think it's going to. I do not think there is any bust related to 5e because they're producing such a low number of products that, I mean, they're not getting people to buy in excess. People instead are turning to the DMs Guild and other things. And it looks to me like those are, kind of working normatively. So another boom and bust certainly could occur, but it's been 17 years now since the last one, except I kind of feel there was a boom and bust related to 4E. It's just not entirely clear how much that impacted the rest of the industry. Some, and I think it was for very different reasons, that it was due to discontent as opposed to, over purchasing.
And then, speaking of like the future and like the growth now, and it seems to be like, more and more it's digital, probably driven a lot by the pandemic and, more people gaming online and that sort of thing. But do you see that shifting away from traditional like paper book role-playing games, or do you think it's always going to be that people want that book in their hand as a collector item or just like something substantial?
Yes and no at different levels. I think that the electronic virtual tabletops have seen a great expansion due to the pandemic, and I think some of that will stick around. I think it's probably shown people how PDFs can be effective. I'm very much a paper sort of person myself, but when I was running my last Pathfinder game, I was starting to, pick up their cheap $10 core rulebook PDFs because it was just so convenient having it on my laptop, even if I had the books nearby, especially when I was running games somewhere that I had to bicycle to, and I wouldn't have wanted to bring 100 pounds of books. So I think we're seeing expansions to all of those, but there really is something to being able to put a book down in the middle of the table and to point at something in it. And there's very much something to be able to talk directly to someone. I do not expect that electronic books or electronic tabletopping will in any way threaten their physical brethren until they become as good as that. And so like my electronic books, great for searching, but pretty terrible to, page forward 3 pages, often to just find something that I could easily look at, the edge of a book and know where it is. And tabletop gaming is relatively horrible compared to, electronic gaming is relatively horrible compared to tabletop gaming. Just, our voices don't mold together well. They, when someone talks, it interrupts everyone else. You can't hear multiple people at once. It's very hard to show a tabletop. The virtual tabletops have been great, and I feel like they are a great alternative in lots of situations where you can't do tabletop gaming, including in the middle of a pandemic. But I'm pretty sure people are going to bounce right back to those tabletop games in the situations that they're able to, as soon as the pandemic is over, as soon as everyone gets their vaccines. Just because at the moment, at least, it is, better for communication, and tabletop games are all about communication. I've been thrilled to be able to do board games with some of my friends from back in the Bay Area throughout the pandemic. And, we set up Zoom, and I set up Zoom on my laptop, and I set up the game on my desktop. But still, we can't have the same type of conversations, especially side conversations, that we could at a table.
And I guess one other kind of trend I would love to hear your thoughts on, and you've written on it, is diversity and inclusion within the industry and within games. And where's your sense on how that's been going and received and being implemented?
I think it's definitely been going. I feel like it's been received well by a good portion of it, and I feel like it's causing some arguments too. But I think it's very important that our industry has been very male dominated and very white dominated. And I say that I'm white, you're white, we're talking to each other about diversity. I think it's very important. I'm very excited that we are seeing games that can, reach out to other people. I thought the recent Call of Cthulhu supplement about, Harlem role playing back in the day, really exciting, because it's, about culture that is not just white culture. And so it's thrilling to see that type of thing. I would love to see that type of expansion more. I've been very happy to see, role-playing companies worry about things as simple as having more representation in iconic characters, which, that's a trend that goes back 20 years, with Wizards of the Coast and Paizo being some of the ones really leading the way in that. So it's very exciting to see all of that. There are some areas where I think we're going to have to kind of figure out, how do we look at these issues? I know one of the big ones that came up last year, I think it was last year, were questions about books like Oriental Adventures, which was a 1985 D&D book about Asia that, well, first of all, the title is not appropriate anymore, but beyond that, it kind of mushed together all of the various Asian mythologies and folklores into one composite, and there were like a couple of Japan analogs, a couple of China analogs, etc. And that's the type of thing that we have to look at and say, A, what do we think of it now? And B, what do we think of the fact that it did exist 35 years ago, and it is part of the history. And so I think there's going to be a lot more work figuring out what the various boundaries are. But right now, we're at a position where we are kind of moving back against a lot of non-diversity and non-inclusiveness. And so we're going to see a lot of push in that direction, and it's, for the good. We're just going to need to continue to see, how's it going?
Okay. Yeah. And I think when I reflect upon just what I was saying about earlier about, you kind of hid away Dungeons and Dragons, but within the gaming world, I think I always felt a lot of acceptance when you'd go to a convention and you would see and meet other people, and you were bonded by your love of the game. So I like to see that.
Yeah, I think conventions are a pretty good melting pot, but I'm also reminded of what I was, some of the things I learned when I was working on the Platinum Appendix for Designers and Dragons, which was a little booklet that I did after the Kickstarter for the Evil Hat versions that included some articles that either I had decided to write during the Kickstarter or that some people had asked to have written. And one of them was about women in the gaming industry. And some of the people that sponsored it were, women who had been role-playing for, 40 years, 30 years. And they said, oh yeah, I remember the conventions back in the 70s. My husband would go there and I would stay home and watch the children. So, conventions, definitely a great place to meet everyone, but also they were a place that might have been kind of self-selected for non-inclusiveness back in the 70s. And that is the type of thing we need to look at and say, is that still the case now? Are there ways that we can make sure that they are inclusive? And I think very importantly, in the last 5 or 10 years, we've also started to say, can we make sure they're safe?
Yeah. The other kind of more recent movement, probably like in maybe it's probably longer, but it's really come to a point lately, is the OSR movement and the retro clones. And what's your kind of thoughts on that movement, and have all the clones been done, and what happens next?
The OSR movement is amazing. It is something that was kind of just peeking out of being a fandom when I wrote Designers and Dragons, and so it's not really in the printed books. It's mentioned here and there, and kind of really exploded right about that time, which was about 10 years ago. One of the things I find interesting is that it's kind of part of this long-term trend where people have constantly been going back and reinventing Dungeons and Dragons because it's, the core game. And so in the 70s, you had people producing what they called VD&D games, variants D&D games. And so I recently was writing a history on Ragnarok Games, who did Isgarth, which kind of is one of the legendary VD&D games. They started out as D&D, and they'd usually add on spell point systems, and they'd usually add on critical hits and fumbles and hit locations. And, depending on how successful they were or weren't, it would get further and further away from D&D. The Arduin Grimoire is the other one that's very well known from that area. So that was the 70s and into the 80s. And then you got into the 90s, and you had desktop publishing, which took off after the Mac came out in 1984. And suddenly you'd had these barriers of entry into the role-playing industry, publishing getting higher and higher as books got better and better looking. And suddenly they dropped because, yes, books were better looking, but anyone could, produce a book that was computer drafted and had pretty good graphics. Though now, if you look back at some of like curved boxes and stuff that were used in those early desktop publishing, they're not that great. And so you saw the fantasy heartbreakers. And this time, instead of going directly after the game systems for D&D and revamping them, they started going after the tropes of D&D and writing their own games, right, which were often very similar. And so Legendary Adventures and Fifth Cycle were the first two of those. They're pretty much unknown right nowadays. I think the only reason we really know about it is because Ron Edwards wrote an article called Fantasy Heartbreakers in the Odd Odds, saying, hey, they were all these great games. Almost everyone had great ideas, but because they were so closely tied to D&D, they didn't go anywhere. But I feel like that was kind of the same trend. And then we get to the Odd Odds, and the Fantasy Heartbreakers, they pretty much died out because of D20, because, why do your own D&D game when you could just go do a D&D supplement legally and get a much bigger audience now? And some very clever people said, well, what if we use the D20 license to go and reinvent these old games, which we can pretty much get to from what's legally allowed to us in the various materials available under the OGL. And it's been very exciting to see all of this work. And the retro clones aren't that exciting. And indeed, when the first retro clone, which was Osric, was made, it wasn't made to be exciting. I should say the pure retro clones aren't very exciting. They're just games. Some of them are very well presented, very well produced, but they're just games, and they're just games that we've seen before. But what was exciting is that they allowed for the recreation of an industry of producing supplements for these games. And I do find very exciting seeing all of these adventures that look just like the adventures that, I excitedly paged through at Toys R Us, when I was young. And they're new, they're exciting, they're innovative, but they're using these old tropes and ideas and styles of artwork and all of that. And I also feel like the retro clones were a relatively small step in the OSR movement. You say, are there more things to retro clone? Yes, there are. And yes, there's also retro clones that you've probably never heard of. But the thing is that after just 3 or 4 years of that, people started saying, well, what if we took these retro clones and we did totally new things with these. And so Stars Without Numbers, I think, is probably one of the ones that's gotten the most success. It's clearly not D&D because it's a science fiction game, but it clearly is D&D. And so that I do find very exciting. These games that are not just, very well produced new editions of classic games, but ones that take those ideas and even those mechanics and expand them in different ways. And that's where the OSR is now, I feel, though. I've written a few histories of the OSR for future books, and one of the things I say there is no one agrees with what OSR is. Anything I say here about what OSR is, people will disagree with, except possibly if I say OSR is what each individual person believes OSR is. And so some people would say it is just those retro clones. Some people would say it's just retro clones of D&D. And some people would say it's this expansive industry that includes all these reinventions of these classic games. And some of these would say it's even totally new games with very modern mechanics, like Shadow of the Demon Lord by Robert Schwab, that feel like old school games. So, what of those actually is the OSR? Everyone has a different answer, but there is a lot of very exciting innovation there. I really love what's being produced for the category of play. I feel like there's three different main kind of streams of development going on right now in role playing. There's our mainstream games, which we've always had. There's the indie games that we've already talked about, and there's the OSR games, and there's some cross development ideas being kicked from one to the other, and it's just very exciting to see so much different game design going on and possibly cross pollinating each other.
For sure. And I mean, I think that speaks to like the independent game designers that are out there now, with the barrier of entry being so low that whether it's distribution or Kickstarter or the technology that we can use to develop these smaller independent games that are a niche, so to speak, but they're able to find an audience because the platforms are allowing it. And I guess one question I have that since you've seen so many years and the patterns and the cycles and that kind of thing, is there any tips that you could give to independent designers that might be watching this? What to avoid, pitfalls, common mistakes?
I might say, see if you can find someone else who's willing to do the business part for you. I think probably the easiest thing to do is to design a great game and to not market it properly. I mean, got DriveThru, you upload it there, that's enough, right? Not enough. I think I could say more generally, the most important thing I have learned in life about creative endeavors is to do something that you totally love. I have been writing these histories for Designers and Dragons because I totally love them. The research, is great. Sometimes I tell my wife, I can't believe I just found out this thing, or I've been, trying to figure out who this person is and who this person is, and they turn out to be the same person writing under slightly different names. She says, yes, honey. But I do it because I love it. And I think that's the biggest thing you can do. If you are doing something because you think it will be successful, it won't be. If you are doing something because you think it's the appropriate thing to do, you're not necessarily going to do it great. But if you do something that excites you, and that can be anything, it can be your totally new game, it can be adventures for your favorite system, it can be a book on the history of the role-playing industry, whichever of those it is, that is the one you should do.
Well, I know in just talking with you and setting up this call today, I kept thinking, boy, you are living your best life. At least I think you are. So, hats off to you for pursuing it. Obviously, it's been, I've got all 4 books here, and I've sought them out because I was like, as soon as I found the first one and I couldn't find the 70s one, I had to go hunt it down. And so anyways, I just think the history that you put together is amazing. And I think if anybody has not had a chance to read them, like I said before, you can get them on DriveThruRPG. I think Evil Hat still has a few hard copies that you can get. Amazon's got a few in different areas. So I encourage you to go out there and look. But before I do that, what is next and I'll put all these links in the show notes and on the video description, but what is next for you, Shannon? What is going on?
Yeah. So just briefly on the books, some of the books are out of print. I don't know which ones, but I remember being told maybe the 80s, maybe the 70s went out of print a year or two ago or now. They do tend to still be available through Amazon. They're starting to go up in price over the $20 cover price. But if people do want to get the current books, my best suggestion is DriveThruRPG, because not only do they have the PDFs, but they have pods of all 4.5 books, the 4 books plus the Platinum Appendix. And the pods are hardcover. They're the only hardcover ones. They're actually what I use for my reference. I have my paperbacks here, though they're starting to get a little flimsier in the humidity of Hawaii. The hardcovers are good. And so if you want a print copy and you can't find them or they're too expensive at Amazon, look for the pods at DriveThru. So what I'm working on now, I finished the original books in 2013, I think. And I spent the next 7 years or so trying to figure out how I could have time to do more histories. And I started on histories for 4 or 5 or 6 companies. I was never able to finish them up. I don't know. I was starting to do more technical writing. I've been doing blockchain related technical writing for several years now. And I just stopped having the energy to do those. Last year, just before the pandemic, we moved to Hawaii. I let go of my full-time job working for SCOTUS and for RPGNet. I cut back to just a few days a week of technical writing, with the idea being that I was going to sit down and work on my own stuff at a desk every day, even though there's really nice beaches and hiking trails there. And I think last June was when I was finally able to finish the switch over. And since then, I have been working, writing histories and my new work for RuneQuest 3 days a week, sometimes a little more. What I am, I currently have, I think 9 books planned. So I am writing new histories. I have 3.5 volumes planned that I am calling Designers and Dragons. 2 books are called the Lost Histories. The first one's going to be the 70s and 80s, and the second one's going to be the 90s and the odd odds. And these are all going to be companies that either I wrote about very briefly in the original books, what I call mini histories there, or I didn't write about it at all. And so I told you I recently wrote on Ragnarok Enterprises. That's a 1979 company. This month I am working on Adventure Games, which is a 1981 company, and Patrick Stevens, which is a mass publisher of books that was founded in the 50s or something. They put out one role-playing book, which is this one, which if you grew up like I did in the 80s, you saw it everywhere. And that's because it was a choice of the Science Fiction Book Club. And so I would suspect it is one of the role-playing books right after D&D that had the most distribution in the 80s. It's not necessarily great. I got the impression that it was never fully play-tested, but it's neat, even if it's not great. I like what I've seen of it, and I've really enjoyed writing the history. So that's going to be the Lost Histories, 2 volumes that have, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 brand new histories in them for companies you haven't seen before. The third book in Designers and Dragons is going to be the Tens, which is the one that I have gotten tons of requests from for about 5 years ago now. I think maybe more. It could be that we finished the Kickstarter in 2014, got everything released, and someone said, so when's the Tens coming out? So the answer is hopefully at the same time as the 2 volumes of Lost Histories. I have written, I think, 5 articles for it so far. 4 of those are the Swedish companies that we've kind of talked about a few times: Riot Minds, Jan Ringen, Free League, and Helmgast. And the 5th one is Monty Cook Games. There's got to be at least 15 more in there. I'm pretty sure maybe more. So at this point, I've written 120,000 words or so among those 3 books. That's 1 book worth. So I have two more to write, and I've been doing it for about a year. So that sounds to me like I'll have first drafts of those in 2023 or so. So those are the first three books. And we put out the Platinum Appendix with the original ones. I'm hoping we can put out something that I'm calling the Chromatic Appendix with these ones. The Chromatic Appendix is my collection of all of the online articles that I have written at RPGNet and that did not appear in some of the books. So these are all kinds of weird and wacky things. Like, I like drawing charts showing how everything connects. And so I have a big chart of, the 20, 30, 40 companies that Chaosium's influence. I have some updates for some of the histories in the original book. So that I hope will go out and be a whole new Designers and Dragons Kickstarter in 2023. Second thing I'm working on, which is another 4 books, is what I call the Txtsr Codex. One of the reasons I didn't have time for writing new Designers and Dragons after I finished the original set is I started working with DriveThruRPG and Wizards of the Coast to write histories of D&D products, because they started releasing them all on D&D Classics, which is now the DM's Guild. And they wanted short little histories for each one. I think they asked me 250 words, maybe 500. And so I started writing long histories for all of the books as they produced them. And so I was writing for several years, 2 or 3 of these every week, in which I'd research as much as I could about the product, what the designers had said, to, as usual, not just talk about the content, but if it was possible, to talk about the history and the decisions and the things like that. And so I wrote those for the D&D Classics website for about 5 years. Kevin Culp was writing them with me. We kind of split things down the middle of 2E. So I wrote AD&D 1E, OD&D, Basic D&D, and the Forgotten Realms, and maybe the generic stuff. I don't remember for AD&D 2E. And he wrote the other half of AD&D 2E and then 3E, which was what was out at the time. And so eventually they got everything out, and I had about 500,000 words that I'd written on these. And DriveThru Roleplaying was kind enough to let me keep the ownership of all of the things I wrote for them. They published them under license, and my intent was always so I could publish them in books. So I'm working on those now. And the first 4 books are going to cover OD&D, AD&D First Edition, and Basic D&D. And that'll be basically 1974 through 1989, and then a little more for the Basic D&D and Mystara and Alliance. So I have a book and a half of those done, and I'm hoping to have all of those for the 50th anniversary we were talking about in 2024, just because it seems like a great time to release them. I think I'll actually have them done before that, but if I sit on them for a little longer so we can put them out for that big release date, then I can keep working on the newer stuff and have better cross-references. So those are kind of the main 8 books. I'm also working on a book on Michael Moorcock's writing, which I've been working on for 5 or 6 years. And every once in a while I finish a book and I write a few more pages, and then I put another book on my pile to read. So those are the big projects right now. And the one other one is, I should say, by the way, though the Designers and Dragons Lost Histories in the 10s are intended for publication, people can see them right now on Patreon. That's kind of what's keeping me on an honest schedule and to make sure I'm at my desk and not at the beach, because I promise people at least 1 history a month and have published 1 to 3 a month since then. And also over at RPGNet, even though I'm not editorially involved with the site in any way, I still publish my columns there, and that's the Advanced Designers and Dragons column. And that kind of continues to be what I call this orthogonal material, where I talk about things that aren't company oriented, like Designers and Dragons. And my goal is to publish 1 a month there, and it's been about 1.5. So this month I published another one of my big charts showing all of the major lawsuits that TSR was involved with, because that
was an interesting one.
It's I grew up of an age where TSR quickly became the enemy to a lot of us in the fandom, and so much of that was because of their litigiousness, and it was interesting recording all of that. The much nicer one, which is I think probably going to come out next week, I've sent it to the editor already, talks about their licenses for computer games and for miniatures, and has a few more charts to show those. Next month, I'm working on things related to Dave Arneson, who we remember is passing this month, and we also remember his first Blackmore game probably this month. And so I've got looks at a couple of the histories that people have done in recent years, including the true history of D&D Blackmore, Secrets of Blackmore. I fortunately have all of this by my desk here. So that's one of the things I'm writing for Advanced Designers and Dragons, and that continues. So I think those are the main projects right now. Like I said, a couple of
just a few on your plate there.
A couple of my days every week go to technical writing, and as much as I can, the rest I keep up on the rest of this. And the Elf book is the last one. I guess that's the 10th book. Elf Pack, it's for Chaosium. It's based upon about 25 years of work and discussions, first with Greg Stafford, from some notes from Ken Rolston, and it was what I was writing about for Trade Talk and for other Gloranthan fanzines like Hearts and Glorantha. So my deadline for that is September, so hopefully that will be done by September.
Well, you've done incredible work up till now, and I'm excited to see what you're doing in the future. And once again, go to Patreon, Designers and Dragons, and you can get in at the entry level of $3 all the way up to $12, and you get insider information on the $12 level. So well worth the money for all this great content. So Shannon, thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing a lot more of your work in the future.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Gary.